And we are going to be in a couple of different, actually 3 different places this morning. We will continue our pattern that we had going on in the previous sessions by looking at a couple of Old Testament passages. And we will then find our way over in Matthew chapter 2 and see some fulfillment there. So we're going to see the prophecies first, which we've been calling the foretelling, and then we will see the fulfilling over in Matthew chapter 2. And let's see how our, no podium for me. Hey, it looks like it's working. The previous service, this wasn't working. Maybe the battery was dead. Who knows? I don't know. Where's Mariah? She left already, right? Okay. Because she's always trying to make fun of me because of the problems I have with the clicker. It's like, man, yeah, so. But she never wants to donate any money to help me get a new clicker, so. We are going to be in a couple of different places, and I am going to have you turn with me as we do so. We're going to start in Hosea chapter 11. So in the Old Testament, there is a book called Hosea, and then after that we'll be in a book called Jeremiah. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And you can see that I have those up there for you, and this is the breakdown of our study this morning. Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. And then in a few minutes we will be over in Jeremiah chapter 31. And then eventually we will make our way to Matthew. And when we get to Matthew, we will finish up our Christmas series. This is actually the last of a 7-part series on Christmas. And this is actually, as you're looking for Hosea chapter 11, this is actually our last service in here too for a little bit. This coming Wednesday is Christmas Eve, so we will not be in here. We'll be in the main sanctuary. And then next Sunday, we will be in the sanctuary also. So we will not be in here. There will be no high school class next Sunday. We'll be in the sanctuary. And then the following Wednesday, we will not be in here because it's New Year's Eve. So we'll be in the sanctuary again. So if you're here during that time, you will not be in here. You'll be in the sanctuary if you're showing up. And then we will eventually, in the new year, I think that means, in the new year, we will be, make our way. So I won't see you till next year. So hopefully you have a good year. Hosea chapter 11 is where we are going to start. And the days following the birth of a child are wild, to say the least. And some of you have probably been involved in some of that as your mom. No doubt if you've got a younger sibling, you may be somewhat familiar with those times. As the addition to the family comes in, everything gets jostled a bit, the schedule and the sleeping times and sometimes the sleeping arrangements. Some of you may be having a younger brother or younger sister, may have had your room invaded by that new addition. And now all of a sudden you've got your little bed in there when you were younger, and now you've got a crib in there, no doubt. Or maybe you were awakened in the middle of the night by a crying baby, that little brother or that little sister, that little brat that was born and messed up your whole life, when you were just that little kid. But the days following the birth can be some of the craziest and most life-changing, because you're trying to adjust. And the days following the birth of Jesus were no different. Some things happened following the birth of Jesus that not only were life-changing, but also fulfilled prophecy, which is what we're doing here in this series. And we see this beginning. We're going to see the foretelling or the prophecies first, and there will be 2 of them that have to do with the birth of Jesus, but something that happened after the birth of Jesus. Up to this point, we've looked at things that were leading up to the birth of Jesus or had to do with the specific birth of Jesus. Now, we're looking at things that happened after the birth of Jesus. Well, we begin our time together in Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, where we get this statement here. When Israel was a child, I loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. Now, Hosea, like so many of the prophets in the Old Testament, was a strange story. Hosea himself was commanded by God to marry a woman who was going to be unfaithful to him, was going to cheat on him. And then he was going to be commanded to go and redeem that woman and bring her back and love her again. Why would God command that? Because what he was doing was he was trying to show his people that, listen, you have been disobedient to me, you've been unfaithful to me, but still I am going to love you. And so sometimes those Old Testament prophets, they preached with their words, sometimes they preached with their actions, and Hosea was one of those. Hosea's life really doesn't have anything to do with chapter 11, verse 1 and what we're reading, but just to understand that God spoke in various ways and different things. And here in Hosea chapter 11, he says, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Now, the setting into which that is put is that the first 10 chapters of Hosea were indictments. It was God speaking to his people and saying, you're guilty of these things. And essentially it was disobedience to God. But by the time God speaks to Hosea in order to speak to his people through chapter 11, verse 1, what he's doing now is telling them, listen, you are guilty of disobedience. However, I still love you. You still are my child. I am your father. Thus the reason why. He says in verse 1 of Hosea chapter 11, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. So, I am a father, God says to them. I still love you, even though you've been disobedient. I still love you, and you're going to be punished. And Hosea, like Isaiah, was prophesying that the Assyrians were coming. And they were right on the cusp of that. The Assyrians were getting ready to attack, and the Assyrians were going to attack and even carry away some of their people, kill, murder, and carry away some of their people. And that was a result of their disobedience. But God wanted them to know, but I still love you. It is a common belief in our society today, and wrongly so. It is a common belief that if you love someone, that you never do anything to disagree or to discipline them. Thus the reason why we have so many bratty kids in the world, right? Because parents have this mindset that, oh, I love them so much, and so I'll just be okay with whatever they do. But that, we would argue from a biblical standpoint, is unloving. If you love someone, you certainly will not agree with everything that they do, because some of the things that they do may be foolish. Some of the things that they do may be harmful, and so they may need to be disciplined. And a loving person is going to discipline that person that is doing the wrong. And so to think that because we love somebody, we just let them do whatever they want is absolutely wrong. And it's unbiblical. And God is demonstrating that here, or at least speaking to that in the book of Hosea and saying, you know what, for the first 10 chapters, you're guilty. You're guilty of being disobedient. However, I still love you. And the Assyrians are coming, but I still love you. And what he does in Hosea chapter 11 is he points back as an example. He says, listen, I love you guys, Israelites. And I've always loved you. And when you were young and you were in Egypt, I loved you and I called you out of Egypt. There in verse 1, out of Egypt I called my son. Now, at first glance or first reading, this doesn't seem prophetic. In fact, this seems historical, because at the point that God is speaking to his people through Hosea, you know, God's people had been in slavery in Egypt, and they've already been called out. That happened a long time ago, by the time that Hosea is speaking. So it doesn't seem like a prophecy at all. Well, we will see that it is prophetic when we get to the book of Matthew, which we're not going to do right now. But just so you and I understand, the foretelling involved, first of all, this moving. The prophecy involved moving. Now again, may not make much sense to you right now, but it will when we get to the book of Matthew. Let's look at the second part of the foretelling, and that would be murder, and mourning. And we are going to see that in Jeremiah 31. So I'll give you a moment to find the book of Jeremiah. It's near Ezekiel, one of the prophets there. You can look at the front of your Bible to find that Jeremiah prophecy, or you can look over on your neighbor's Bible or have them help you if they found it real quickly. And what a strange set of titles to have for a Christmas message. Moving, and then even more so, murder and mourning. So we will see how this applies to the Christmas story in just a few minutes, but we'll look at Jeremiah 31, verse 15. I can hear the Bible pages turning, so I'll wait another minute. Not a big rush. I have time. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15. Now, I mentioned very briefly how strange the story of Hosea starts out. Jeremiah is another strange one. Jeremiah was actually a young man when God called him to be a prophet, a priest and a prophet. And some people, Bible scholars tend to believe that he was somewhere between the age of 17 and 20. 17 and 20, so right about our age. And 17 and 20, and he actually, in the first chapter, when God calls Jeremiah, he actually says to God, I can't be a prophet, I'm too young. And God, of course, convinces him otherwise and says, no, your age doesn't matter. I'm going to be with you, I'm going to bless you. And so he starts out his ministry very young. But a strange thing about Jeremiah, or at least his ministry, his job was to warn the people about the coming of the Babylonians. Now, we've talked several times throughout this series about the coming of the Assyrians. God was going to use the Assyrians to discipline his own people. Well, that has happened, and now God says this is a different time, and God is going to bring in the Babylonians now to do the same thing because the people have been disobedient, and God, being a consistent, loving Father, disciplines them again, and he's warning them through the prophet Jeremiah, saying, you know what, I'm bringing the Babylonians this time. But Jeremiah, strangely enough, he prophesied for multiple years and never had one convert. Not even one person. In other words, not even one person ever listened to him and turned from their sins. Not one. He was known as the weeping prophet because he spent so much time crying and weeping over the disobedience of the people. But not once in his entire ministry did anyone ever say, you know what, I've heard your preaching, I'm turning my ways, I'm going to turn back to God. Not once. It's a difficult thing to speak to people. As many of you know, there are many of you in here that if I said, hey, you get up here, I want you to talk to everybody, you would melt in your seat. There's no way. It's like, I'm not getting in front of anybody. For many people, the only thing scarier than death is public speaking for a lot of people. Some people don't mind it so much. They have, they don't have a hard time doing it. But even if you don't mind doing it, or even if you, like me, love talking to other people in this setting, it is very, very difficult to talk to people when they do not want to hear you. And that was Jeremiah. God had called him to a ministry to go and preach to people that were never going to listen to him. Why would God do that? What God was demonstrating was the hardness of the heart of those people. And the fact that God never gave up. He kept attempting to reach them, but they were never going to turn. And so no one could ever fault God and say, oh, you know what, you never gave us a chance. You never did anything for us. No. Sent you prophet after prophet after prophet. Sent you Jeremiah. You never turned. Now, again, as I mentioned with Hosea, I gave you some of those background facts, but like with Hosea, it really doesn't have much to do with the verse that we're reading. Let's read the verse, Jeremiah 31:15. Thus says the Lord, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, that's lamenting, and bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Now, this verse takes place, it's in a bit of a funny spot there in Jeremiah 31, because actually in Jeremiah 31, there's encouragement taking place. And then smack dab in the middle of it, there is this verse about lamenting, bitter weeping, refusing to be comforted, children that are no more. But what's taking place there in the chapter is that God is encouraging his people and saying, you know what? I am bringing in the Babylonians. That is a fact. You can't, that's coming. Can't stop that. But after the Babylonians have come and gone, I will restore. And in chapter 31, verse 15 of Jeremiah, what's happening is there's this prophecy about the moms, basically the families at that time, who will be weeping for their children that were killed or taken away by the Babylonians. And then God immediately after that begins to encourage them and say, listen, I know that you're weeping, but essentially I'm going to restore life to you. And he even says that he's going to bring their kids back to their borders and back to their doors. And so it's this phenomenal section there in Jeremiah 31. But this one verse here, let's look at the verse itself. A voice was heard in Ramah, which was where this lady Rachel was actually buried. So it's almost this picture of Rachel being resurrected. And for what? For weeping? Really? Rachel was the wife of a guy named Jacob. Jacob had his name changed. He got in a wrestling match with God. Who wrestles against God and wins? No one. Although we might say that Jacob actually did win, but only in the sense that his life was changed from that point on. He walked away from that wrestling match with a lifelong disability. Okay, he had a limp for the rest of his life, walked with a staff, but he also got his name changed to Israel. And he went from Jacob the deceiver to Israel, which means governed by God. Now, Rachel is here in this prophecy is seen as the mother, in a sense, the mother of the people. If Jacob and / Israel was the father, so to speak, then Rachel was like the mother, and she's weeping for her children. What children? The children who have been killed or carried away by the Babylonians. And you'll note that there is lamenting going on. There is bitter weeping going on. And why is she lamenting? Why is she bitter and weeping? She's weeping for her children. And why is that? She's refusing to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Again, they're gone. They've been killed or carried away. Now, I don't know, I don't know if you've had the opportunity to be involved in the birth of a child, through a parent, obviously, or maybe maybe a sister or a brother or somebody that's had a child, or an aunt and an uncle, whoever it might be. But that's a joyous occasion. You go, that's always a fun thing, and it's very natural. Very natural. Although, you may have had a younger brother or younger sister, again, as I mentioned earlier, you go, oh man, they messed up my whole life when they came in. I've got a cousin that's actually a bit older than me. And before I was born, I actually have pictures. Before I was born, my parents used to love on him a whole bunch. And they have pictures. They used to pick him up, their nephew, pick him up and take him all over the place, Knott's Berry Farm, and, do all kinds of things with him. And then when I was born, when they finally had their own kid, they kicked him to the curb. And years later, it was the funniest thing. He told me, he was joking. He says, man, he goes, when you were born, he said, I hated you. He said, because then he says, your mom and dad stopped taking me places, man. They started taking you everywhere. And so you might have somebody like that in your life when you were younger and they were born. You're like, they messed up my whole life. But it's natural to have children, right? For parents to have children. What is unnatural is for parents to bury their children. That's not supposed to happen. We do not like death, but we understand that it is a natural part of life. But for a parent to bury their own child, and I don't know if you've had any, I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, if you've experienced that at all with anybody, maybe your own family or maybe a family friend or some extended family, but it's unnatural. And it's hard for that parent to deal with that grief. For us, as we get older, eventually we will bury our parents. I've had to bury my mom. Although I was sad and I miss her still, it was natural. That's what's supposed to happen. She gets older, she dies, the kids bury her. That's what goes on. But for the parent to have to bury their child is very unnatural. And that here is described for us in her lamentation and her bitter weeping and refusing to be comforted, not because she just can't be or doesn't want to be comforted, but because she cannot. It's unnatural to have to lose your children, especially in that way. It's one thing to lose your child in an accident or because they get sick, but for someone to invade your home and steal your child or kill your child in front of your eyes is horrific. And so Rachel here, who at the time that Jeremiah is speaking, she's no longer alive, but she's seen as, she's used as this picture of the moms of Israel weeping because the Babylonians came and killed or took captive their kids. They're no more. What a strange couple of points to have included in a Christmas message, right? But as we've gone through all 7 of these sessions, these 7 different parts, we might say, these really aren't that strange. We've seen lots of strange things, but certainly these are among the strangest, especially as I have here, murder and mourning concerning the birth of Jesus. What is that all about? Well, what you and I will do now is we'll go over to Matthew chapter 2, and this will be the last place that we go to. So go ahead and meet me in Matthew chapter 2. We'll start in verse 1. We'll read through a portion of the Christmas story in order to get a setting and to get a running start. And then we will look at the fulfillment of these 2 prophecies. Matthew chapter 2, verse 1. In Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea." And I would suggest that it's possible that what we're reading right now happened possibly up to 2 years after the birth of Jesus. So a couple of little indicators in here, but it's not really that big of a deal for us as far as our points are concerned, but let's look at this. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. And they said in verse 2, 'Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him.' When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him." We're familiar with that because we've mentioned that a couple of times in a couple of different studies during this series. Herod did not want to lose his power or his position. So when he sees this group of guys show up saying, "Where's this guy who's been born King of the Jews?" he thinks another king, and what he sees is a threat to his position, to his power. And so he's troubled. Why is all Jerusalem troubled with him? Because they know that Herod is an evil ruler. In fact, at this point, he's already killed. He's already killed family members in order to protect his position. And they know that if Herod is angry, that they are going to suffer. And in fact, that is what happens in this story. Verse 4 says, "And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born." So Herod hears about this new king of the Jews. He gathers from talking to the wise men. We may assume that this has something to do with the Christ, the Messiah. And he says, where's the Christ to be born? He gathers all of his religious leaders and says, hey, you guys study the scriptures. What do the prophecies say about this Christ? Now, just an interesting little fact, in case you didn't know this, Christ is not Jesus' last name. It is a title. It wasn't like, oh, that's Joseph and Mary Christ and their son, Jesus Christ. That's not his last name. It is a title. It's like Julius Caesar. Caesar is not a salad, and it's not his last name. It is a title. It's Julius the Caesar. Julius the King is what that means. Same thing here. Where is the Christ? So he gathers his religious leaders together and says, you guys have been studying the scriptures. Where is this Christ supposed to be born? And so in verse 5, they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it is written by the prophet. And you and I looked at this previously. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not the least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, this is different points for a different study for a different time. We've covered it in the past. We'll cover it again in the future, no doubt. But this guy, and I don't know how many of you caught it, but the title of today's message, this specific one, the series is called Fulfilled, but I titled this message Christmas, Christmiss. In other words, Herod missed the Christ, Christmas. But here is Herod. Herod finds out. He believes. Now, this is the craziest thing. He believes in the prophecy about Christ. At least so much in that he asked the religious leaders, where is this kid supposed to be born? Now, we know the story here, and we'll read it in just a moment. What he's about to do is he's about to tell the wise men, go and look for him. So, it's the craziest thing that Herod believes the prophecy to be true. Okay? The baby, my religious leaders tell me that he is going to be born in Bethlehem, so you guys need to go to Bethlehem and look for him. So he believes in the prophecy, at least believes that there's going to be a child born that people believe is the king of the Jews or the king or the Messiah, and he's even willing to send these guys go look for him. He doesn't say, oh, please, that's a fantasy. You guys just go back to your homes. There's no king. Get out of here. He doesn't play it off. He understands, oh, there is a baby being born. He believes that. But let's see his reaction here in verse 5, or rather verse 7. Then Herod, when he had secretly called the wise men, determined from them what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. Now, we know that he's lying. He doesn't want to go and worship Jesus. He wants to eliminate him. But fascinatingly enough, in verse 7, when he finds out about the prophecy, he then calls the wise men back. So we're assuming here that the wise men are not clear on the prophecy because they would have known to just go to Bethlehem. But they're not clear on all that. They've followed a star to get there. That star led them to Jerusalem. They're there, and now they're looking, where is this new, we saw the star, but the star, it seems to us, may have disappeared, and now they're asking the king, where do we find this new king? We figure you must know about it because you're the ruler in this area, in this land, so certainly you would know about it. And he goes, calls his religious leaders, oh, okay, yeah, they're in Bethlehem. You got to go look in Bethlehem. And in verse 7, he determined, this is something you want to lock away in your mind for a few minutes at least, because it will come to play when we get down to the bottom of our study. he determined from them what time the star appeared. So he calls them secretly. Why is that? Because he's hatching a plan, a plot to eliminate Jesus. But what he does in the process of telling them to go look in Bethlehem is he says, oh, by the way, when did you guys first see the star? And he finds out whenever that is, we're not told. They began to follow the star. They were in the east. We don't know where they were from. So all kinds of speculation, but we don't know where they were from. It just says from the east. They started following the star. What was it about the star? We have no clue. We don't know. It doesn't say. We can assume, I think safely, that the star was moving, which isn't so strange, right? Because we see falling stars, we call them today, where, you'll see a chunk of, some star, the chunk that falls down into the atmosphere of Earth and burns up. You'll see those occasionally. Or you might be outside laying down looking at the stars, and you might see shooting stars, something shoot through the sky. So to think that a star was moving is not so strange, but for a star to move at a pace that someone could follow it, well, that's an entirely different thing. And it leads them to this place, but then it seems to disappear. And so they find out, hey, we got to go to Bethlehem, but he wants to know, when did you see the star? And no doubt asked them, when did you first see the star, and how long have you been traveling? When did you first see it? And how long has it been? How long has it been since you saw the star? Now, we'll find out why he asked that in a few minutes here, but he tells them, go search carefully for the young child. Okay? He doesn't send them to look for a baby, but for a young child. And when you found him, bring back word to me that I may come and worship him also. And in verse 9, when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. And when they had come into the house. So, it's a very good possibility that Jesus is no longer in the manger at this point, but now they have moved into a house. Again, it's possibly a little bit of proof that Jesus was no longer an infant at this point, but was now maybe even up to 2 years old. Because now they're looking for a young child. Now they're looking in a house. At the beginning of the chapter, it said these things happened after the birth of Jesus. And so, we've got a manger scene in here. Manger scenes, they normally will include Joseph and Mary and the baby, usually some shepherds or some angels, some animals, but also they oftentimes will have 3 wise men, and they'll have the gifts there. And that may be accurate or it may be inaccurate, but in the big picture, it really doesn't matter. The birth of Jesus happened. The wise men, in fact, did show up, regardless of whether they showed up right away, or if it was later, or even if it was 2 years later. They still showed up. They were part of the story. And so here, they come into the house, we're told in verse 11. Now, what happens there in verse 11 is wild. And we don't have a lot of time to spend in this because this is not the main point of our study. So I'll mention it briefly and then we'll move on. But verse 11, when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped them. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented gifts to him, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, just very briefly, what a strange thing for someone to come into their house. Now, Joseph and Mary, it is believed that they were peasants. I don't mean to be disrespectful to that family, but they were not wealthy. They were not rich people, which is proven to us by the fact that they couldn't find a place to stay. If they had had enough money, they would have been able to pay someone to, give them a room. But they didn't have enough, and there wasn't enough room, and so they had to stay outside. He's born, laid in this manger. But here come these wise men. Now, we don't know how many there were. My manger scene that I have at home has 3 of them, but it doesn't say how many there were. It says that there were 3 gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So we assume that each of these wise men was carrying a gift. One had gold, one had frankincense, one had myrrh. But in fact, it doesn't say. And they could have had 10 boxes full of gold and 3 boxes full of myrrh, and they could have had multiple gifts. So we're not told. We know that there were wise men. It's multiple, so it was either 2, or it could have been 20, or it could have been 40, or it could have been 15, or we don't know what it was. But we do know that, in fact, they showed up, and they presented to him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, they've just come into a peasant home. These were obviously wealthy men who not only had these wonderful gifts to give, but also had the means to travel, to pay for all of that travel along the road, along the route, along the way. Now, the last thing that I will mention in verse 11 is important, but again, it's not the main point of our study, and we've got to move on, and that is, note the order in which they presented to Jesus. They come in, they fall down and worship. That was first. And then they gave gifts. So what's the more important thing at Christmas time? You and I know this, although we get really excited for the gifts. I'm really excited for gifts. Not only my gifts, whatever I'm going to get, but also the gifts that I'm giving to my family. I'm excited about those things. But I understand that with or without the gifts, with or without the tree, with or without the lights, with or without the garland, with or without the wreath, with or without the decorations, the food, the family, all the different things that we do, even without those things, I still possess Christmas in that I've got Jesus. Jesus is at the center of it all. He's the reason for it all. And the wise men understood that. Thus the reason why they came in and they first bowed down. They gave themselves to God before they gave gifts. So important for you and I to remember that. However, again, that's not the main point of our study, so let's move on. It says in verse 12, then being divinely warned in a dream that they should not return to Herod. Why not? Because Herod wanted to kill the young child. So they've been warned. What did they do? They departed for their own country another way. They skipped town. They didn't say anything to Herod because Herod wants to kill the young child. They found that out in a dream. Now they're going the other way around, avoiding Herod. Now we've been in the fulfilling section, but let's get some subpoints up here. Verses 13 through 15, I titled Moving. Let's see the fulfillment of that first prophecy from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1. Now when they had departed, this is the wise men, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, arise, take the young child and his mother, flee to Egypt, and stay there until I bring you word, for Herod will seek the young child to destroy him. When he arose, he took the young child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. What did he do? God moved the family, including Jesus, out of Bethlehem. And where to? To Egypt. You go, yeah, but the prophecy said, I called my son out of Egypt. Well, that's what Matthew reveals us to here. Look at this verse 15. And was there until the death of Herod, that it might be fulfilled, which was spoken by the Lord through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. So, bam. God speaks to Joseph in a dream, says, get your family out of here, go to Egypt. He wakes up, he takes his family at night, sneaks out of town, goes to Egypt. They stay there until they hear the news that Herod is dead. Once they hear that Herod is dead, they then move out of Egypt and start to head back home. Now, they don't end up back at home quite yet, but at least they leave Egypt, and bam, there we have another fulfillment of another prophecy there, that God indeed called his son, Jesus, out of Egypt. Now, had Jesus fulfilled every prophecy up until now, but then wasn't called out of Egypt, we would have no reason to believe that he was the Messiah. He would not have fulfilled all of the prophecies. So we may look at this and go, look, it's a minor detail. You know, he was born already. His mom was a virgin. I mean, all the different things. What does it really matter? No, it matters. Either everything that has been said about him is true and accurate, or else it is untrustworthy. It's got to be accurate 100%. And so here we see yet again this prophecy fulfilled. Now, how about this for a Christmas message? Here's some madness and murder in verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry. Remember, Jerusalem was troubled with him. Remember it said that? All Jerusalem was troubled with him. Why? Here's why. Verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under. Why 2 years old and under? According to the time which he had determined from the wise men. Now, we do not know exactly what time they gave him as to when they first saw the star. They could have said, well, we saw the star 6 months ago or a year ago. And it may be that Herod decided, well, just to be safe, any child that's 2 and under, we're going to kill. Or they could have said, well, we saw the star 2 years ago and we've been traveling for 2 years to get here to find him. Whichever it was, he determined 2 years old and under. So it's possible that Jesus was no longer an infant, but now 1 or even 2 years old. And now he's being hunted. Now, what a strange part to have in the Christmas story, madness and murder. But then again, it's not that strange. Do you remember Jesus later on in his life would say, I did not come to bring peace, but anybody remember what he was bringing? A sword. Josh, thank you very much. He says, I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. What did he mean by that? He meant that Jesus himself would be the cause of major decisions. People would either love him and thus love people or mankind, or they would hate him and thus hate mankind. People can be divided into those two groups. They either love Jesus and thus love mankind, or they hate Jesus and hate mankind. And he said, I didn't come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. No, he did come to bring peace. But what he was pointing out in that statement was that people were going to make decisions based on what they believed about him or how they felt about him. And it begins right at his birth here, as he's a young child. Here is Herod in his fury and trying to find this newborn king of the Jews, has all of these children massacred, murdered. It's madness of the king. Now, for our final point, verses 17 and 18, as we finish out our series, we have the morning. Then was fulfilled. There's the title of our study again. We saw it back in verse 15. Here it is again, verse 17. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremiah the prophet, saying, a voice was heard in Ramah, lamentation, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, refusing to be comforted because they are no more. So what Matthew reveals to us in these two passages, or in these two prophecies, is that these prophecies were given and they had application to the time that they were given, years prior to this, back in the time of Hosea and in the time of Jeremiah. But what he's pointing out for us is that they had their ultimate fulfillment in the life of Jesus and the birth of Jesus, surrounding the birth of Jesus. And here, in fact, to be a little more detailed, after the birth of Jesus. Jesus fulfilled every prophecy concerning himself. So many of them that we've studied here over the last 7 sessions have been just about his birth. We haven't even talked about the rest of his life, just about his birth. Every prophecy, and you know, they've all over the ages have been scrutinized by critics, looking for shortcomings and failings and looking for, times where he didn't fulfill the prophecies. He fulfilled every single one of them. No one can debate that. That's the truth. So we started out our series by saying, listen, we've got proof that Jesus really, a man named Jesus really did live. We talked about Josephus and Tacitus, who were historians. We talked about early church fathers and church writings. Other historians, there are multiple sources. We know that a man named Jesus lived. That's the fact. But what happened to him, what was said about him, those things we find in the Bible. And we then are faced with a decision. We know that Jesus lived, but what do we believe about Jesus? That's the decision that you and I have to come to. Now, many of us in here, most of us, maybe all of us, have decided that Jesus, being an actual, factual, historical figure, we know that he really did believe, and we believe what the Bible said about him. We have thus made a decision that, yes, we believe in Jesus. We believe that Jesus died for my sins, and I have placed my faith in Jesus, and I'm now saved. I've had my sins forgiven, and I now have the promise of eternal life. But there may be someone in here who hasn't done that. You've not come to that conclusion. Well, we've just spent 7 sessions looking at the fact that Jesus fulfilled every single one of the prophecies that was made about him, at least up to this point. He was a real person who really did exist, lived, and walk the earth. So now the question is, what do you believe about Jesus? What the Bible says is that he, when he came to this earth, was sent by God the Father. He was God in flesh, God the Son. That he lived a perfect or sinless life. And that when he died on the cross 2,000 years ago, that he died to pay for the sins of the world. That means everybody. He was offering himself, paying for the sins of the world, so that anybody who believed in his death and who would say, you know what, no, his death paid for my sins, I can't pay for my own sins. And not only that, but his death makes it possible for me to go to heaven. I can't get myself there. So that anybody that would place their faith in him would be saved, would have their sins forgiven, would have the promise of eternal life. If you haven't done that yet, do that. The rest of us have done it. If you haven't believed, if you haven't stated that and said, no, God, I believe in your salvation. I can't save myself. If you haven't done that yet, do that today. I'll lead you in a very simple prayer to do that this afternoon. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for today and for your word.